I think we have a minimum quorum. Others will join in as they do, but we can start.
Very good. So, welcome everybody to the fourth and last session of our Europe and India in the global perspective. We have had so far three extremely interesting sessions, and I've no doubt that this session will be equally interesting and equally timely. No, the seminar is a joint venture of think tank in New Delhi, CPR, the Center for Policy Research, and a European think tank, Bruegel, based here in Brussels. And I've had the great pleasure and honor to co-chair this with the Ambassador Saran, who is the former Foreign Secretary of India and has served as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change. So this session will really have two parts. The first part, 75 minutes, will be devoted to the issue of the digital transformation, and we will hear from our two panelists. And after hearing from the panelists, they will first debate a little bit among themselves, responding to their presentations, and then we will open the floor for discussion. And I would like to invite already everyone to be aware of the question and answer facility on your screen. So if you please raise questions, I shall then read them to the panelists. At the end of this session on digital transformation, we will hear from Ambassador Saran, who will draw a conclusion from this session. And then we will hear from Suman Berry, who has been instrumental in the organization of the entire webinar. Suman will draw conclusion on the overall webinar on all four sessions. What have we learned and what may be the next steps for Bruegel and CPR together to foster collaboration between India and Europe, with a way to not only understand each other better, but also to work together both bilaterally and in multilateral fora. So without any further ado, let me open this session on the digital transformation. And let me first welcome Anand Padmanabhan, who is a visiting fellow at CPR. He's a legal scholar and a legal practitioner with a huge record and experience in the field of digital policy, technology policy, intellectual property rights, innovation, scholarship. He's the author of Intellectual Property Rights, Infringement and Remedies, published by LexisNexis, and he has recently co-edited an important volume on India as a pioneer of innovation, published by Oxford University Press. He has been involved with a number of organizations, including Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in New Delhi. And as I said, he's both a scholar and a practitioner of law. He holds a master's degree in law from University of Pennsylvania Law School, and is currently completing his doctoral thesis at the University of Pennsylvania on digital copyright. So Anand, the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Sure. Thanks, Andre. And this is wonderful to see all of us getting together to discuss digital transformation. I think it's a theme that cuts across jurisdictions and is sort of giving policymakers sleepless nights. And it's also interesting that we are discussing this, particularly in the context of Indo and European Union collaborations and potential collaborations, because I think there's a lot that India for sure can learn, and is already in some sense learning from the EU on various aspects of technology regulation. And of course, it's good to have Georgios on this panel. We did have an informal chat before the panel just to get a sense of what themes we will kind of cover. And one thing was pretty evident, that there cannot be any sort of conversation on digital transformation unless we are having a serious discussion around data. So I will, in the 15 minutes that I have, I don't have a presentation, I'm sorry about that. But we both have worked on a structure of sorts, and I will kind of speak a little bit about India's tryst with data regulation, because there is just a lot happening there, and there are a lot of intersectionalities with what's happening in the European Union. So to begin with, let me just say that, you know, the entire set of conversations that the nation is witnessing at this point, including what is currently going on before the Joint Select Committee of Parliament, specially constituted to examine the personal data protection bill under the chairmanship of Ms. Meenakshi Lekhi, MP, is in some sense owes its origins to the GDPR and the conversations around data and data protection even before the GDPR coming into effect in the European Union. The reason I say this is again because India has been often considered as a data protection inadequate jurisdiction, and this has been a bone of contention when it comes to mass data transfers, without the special rules applicable to specific organizations, which we all know is one method. But India has always desired, especially keeping in mind the needs of its information technology industry, that there is a more generalized mechanism for data transfers between EU and India. And that has not happened primarily because there is no data protection law for the country. So what we do have instead is, as we all know, these sensitive personal data and information rules under the Information Technology Act, which came into force the rules came into force in 2011. We have had several attempts at data protection law or a privacy law, and one of them notably was the AP Shah committee, which came out with a pretty comprehensive report and a deep understanding of data protection principles, mainly it's inspired from the OECD guidelines. But for a brief while, there had been a lull in conversations around data protection. There were many various leaked drafts of the privacy bill, but nothing really for sure or for certain. And we all know that in 2014, NDA 1 came into power, and in many ways, what we are seeing is the fallout of a domestic imperative, which is the push for Aadhaar. So while internationally EU has been a major reason or motivator for having these conversations around data protection, and which in turn are now leading up towards a formal legislation in place, domestically Aadhaar has been a prime mover of conversations around data protection. Part of the reason is that this whole biometric project, looking to provide goods and services on the basis of biometric identities to more than 1 billion people, came under spotlight, and in particular, judicial review of this whole scheme, primarily on the basis that it was not sufficiently protective of the privacy interests of Indian citizens. And in 2017, there was a unanimous 9-judge bench verdict of the Supreme Court that laid out very clearly that privacy is a fundamental right under the Indian Constitution. And therefore, for a while, this whole issue of not having a data protection bill kept coming up during the other hearings, and finally the government considered that while Aadhaar needs to be evaluated on the basis of the broader right to privacy and the exceptions, there will also soon enough be a data protection law that protects personal data of Indian citizens on a more general basis. And that's how the Sri Krishna committee was constituted. And then, of course, they came out with a version of a personal data protection bill, and now we have a subsequent version. So, with that background in mind, I have been looking at the GDPR and the Personal Data Protection Bill of 2019, comparing the two. So, there are a few things that really stand out. The first is that in terms of the overall idea of protection, there aren't too many differences. Of course, there are points where we can keep debating, going back and forth, such as the right to erasure not being a meaningful right under the Indian bill, or the fact that there not being a clear right against data profiling in the Indian bill. Or if you look at things from the other side of the spectrum in terms of higher degree of protection in the Indian bill over GDPR, there are quite a few instances where there is a stronger regulatory intervention, like protection of children, right? I think the Indian bill takes a much stronger hardline stance against processing data for various purposes when children are involved, right? So one can say that the protection levels may vary on different themes, but broadly there is a this underlying idea that the GDPR has in some sense set the template, and what we need to do is work on that template. But having said that, I think there are a few things that really stand out, right? The first is the extent of power that is given to the data protection authority in the Indian bill, right? And I think the regulatory architecture is such that, I mean, there is a very wide set of powers given to the data protection authority in the Indian context. And that's something I think needs a lot of fine tuning as we go along if this current version of the bill becomes the law. And when I say fine tuning, what I mean is that there's a lot of rule making authority, there's a lot of adjudicatory authority, and there is zero institutional memory, right? So in the Indian context, personal data protection is honestly a truly greenfield project, right? Even though we have the SPDI rules, they never really had any enforcement mechanism to boot. So it was just sort of exhortation of the various principles that need to be complied with, and it does a decent job of those principles, but nothing in terms of the procedure and the enforcement mechanism. So if India is going the data protection, personal data protection way in terms of something along the lines of GDPR, I think there is a lot of collaboration open there, just because there's a lot of training required for this new regulator to understand how rule making happens, to understand how technical evidence is led in cases involving data protection breaches or violations of the data protection law. Uh, the second thing that I found quite interesting was, of course, the excessive power given to the state under the Personal Data Protection Bill, which is not the case with GDPR. The third element, and this is a strand which continues to linger, is the point around non-personal data. So if you look at the Personal Data Protection Bill, the idea was, as the title indicates, to regulate personal data, but for whatever reason, the bill currently talks about non-personal data as well. And I think we can speak a little more about it as the conversation unfolds. But I think this is a major change or deviation that India is in many ways adopting to, one, make the non-personal data come within the ambit of the Personal Data Protection Bill itself, albeit in very limited ways, but there is a provision which talks about that data, non-personal data, and calling in for that data. That's one. And the second is that there's a larger policy initiative now underway with the Non-Personal Data Protection Committee headed by Chris Gopalakrishnan coming out with its recommendation to set up a data authority to deal with non-personal data. And the implications of that, I think the common theme running through this non-personal data set of recommendations and the provisions to do with localization in the personal data protection bill, again something which is strikingly absent in GDPR, is I think this move towards sort of assertion, a fairly muscular assertion that the data of Indian citizens is meant to be used here, extracted here, and sought value out of in India. And we need to create architectural mechanisms, regulatory mechanisms to stop too much of data flows. And even if data flows were to happen, extraction of value in multiple different ways from organizations that depend on Indian data, be it personal data or non-personal data. So I will pause here, but I think there is a lot really happening, and there is a lot to learn, and there is also a lot which I think the EU experience can help us push back on as civil society actors.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anand. It was interesting that you put the emphasis on the process, and I think it was very interesting for the European audience on the ongoing process in India, legislative process on data protection. I suspect, but I don't know, that Georgios, who is an economic scholar, not a legal scholar, an economic scholar, will also, I suppose, speak about data and data protection, but I suppose also some of the economic dimension related to data and data processing, and the role of some of the firms in this space. So let me just say a few words of introduction about Georgios Petropoulos, who is a research fellow at Bruegel, where he has been a resident fellow since 2016. He's currently a Marie Curie research fellow and a postdoctoral fellow at MIT. So dividing, in a sense, his time between MIT and Bruegel, with also an affiliation with Stanford. So he's really at the heart of where the economic issues, maybe less the legal, but the economic developments are taking part, both around Boston and around the Silicon Valley. So Georgios has written extensively on the implication of digital technologies for innovation, competition policy, and also labor markets. And the main focus of his current research, very much together with some of colleagues at MIT or in Boston in general, has been on the regulation of digital platform from an economic perspective, with the relationship between big data and market competition, as well as how the adoption of robots and information technologies does affect labor markets and firms' market returns. Georgios has a bachelor degree in physics, comes actually partly from astrophysics, then moved into economics, and he has a PhD in economics from Toulouse University in France. So Georgios, the floor is yours now for your 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here, and it was very nice to interact in advance of this event with Anand and discuss some very interesting issues of common interest. So my background, as Andres said, is on economics, so I will avoid going to legal details. It's not my expertise, and Anand can correct me later if I make any inaccurate claim in terms of legal principles. So on the economics perspective, I want to start by referring to data and the value it can confer in the online ecosystem, and to the different actors that participate in it. And we have seen with, especially in the last decade, with the development of data analytics, machine learning techniques, have provided new ways and new insights how to derive benefits from data through the provision of digital services. And that benefits can vary from the monetization of data for the providers of the services, but also they include the increase in the efficiency in online interactions and transactions, and consequently an increase in consumer welfare. As a result, the free flow of data can increase benefits from trade, provided that the online ecosystem remains trustworthy, people want to participate in it, consumers feel safe and do not face risks to participate in it. And examples of how data flows can help is, for example, they can increase the benefits because of the personalization of services and products. The consumers, the online users can receive tailored services to their needs and preferences. They can enable the coordination of international production processes through global value chains. They can help small firms to reach global markets and grow. They can facilitate automation in the trade facilitation and how trade relationships are implemented. They can accommodate transaction of data where data is considered as an asset. But for this to happen, the principle in Europe is that we need to have strong privacy rights. And we need to have strong privacy rights because this is a fundamental right of people. So that goes far beyond potential economic benefits. It's a fundamental right, period. And as Anand mentioned, we have the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which provides a framework within which we can have a free flow of data subject to some specific conditions. So the one is that the users, they should, in most of cases, consent for this, their data to flow from one particular point to another point in the digital ecosystem. Secondly, it is we need to only have flow of data that it is absolutely necessary to reach a particular interaction efficiency in an interaction. So we don't have an excessive flow of data that is beyond to what it is necessary to derive some benefits. And the starting point is that privacy rules try to improve the transparency and the control the users have over their data in the online ecosystem as a way to increase, to contribute to the trust, which is a fundamental factor for the growth and success of online trade, online transactions. So with this respect, free flow of data can be done through directly between businesses or from business to the consumer who provides the data. We're talking all this time for personal data. But the problem is that while in principle we have this right to give a consent and move data from one provider to another, for example, which can bring some additional benefits, we lack the technical standards, we lack the interoperability, we lack the compatibility standards for this to occur. And that limits so much the scope of this flow of data under GDPR. I mean, there are examples of sectoral regulations, for example, the Payment Services Directive 2, which basically exactly provided these technical standards and also the additional rules needed to make this information and data access and sharing available, a reality. And this regulation, the Payment Services Directive 2, refers to account information. Account holders should give the consent, and small fintech firms, through the consent of the account holders, can access account information of these people in established banks in the European Union. So this is an example which basically says if we want to have a free flow of data, GDPR is not enough. We need the technical aspects which are missing. Having this in mind, and also having in mind the benefits from data transfers, one particular aspect is transferring data to other jurisdictions. And Ananth referred to some key differences between GDPR and the Indian data protection bill. This is not the only case that we have fundamental differences between two jurisdictions. This is, I would say, the norm. So GDPR allows data to be transferred to other jurisdictions only if European citizens receive adequate protection over their data, which implies some obligations for firms outside the EU on how to treat this data. These obligations in general by GDPR can be costly. It can be costly especially for the small and medium enterprises. But on the other hand, if indeed GDPR increase the online trust and incentivize users, consumers to participate in online trade, probably these negative effects are counterbalanced. This is a subject of research and I don't have an answer. The point that I want to make is that despite the fact that we have fundamental differences in the way we understand privacy around the world, it is important to focus on the interoperability between the data protection standards at different jurisdictions. Because if we do that, I mean, we cannot demand another jurisdiction to have the same perception over privacy that I have. But if we can derive some interoperable mechanism which allow data transfer, we can maximize the benefits from the flow of data. On the non-personal data, we have some new pieces of regulation in Europe, the free flow of data regulation that provides business-to-business data portability rights in open standard formats. We have the Digital Content Directive that tries to establish a similar right for business to consumer. But I think the most important is to look ahead. The European Commission in February 2020 adopted the European Data Strategy that aims by 2030 to create, through legislation and coordinated investment strategy, a single European data space in which both personal and non-personal data will be accessible by the different actors of the ecosystems so that to maximize the benefit and boost growth. And this also data economy has also the expectation to, there is the expectation to be expanded beyond EU. So I think it's a very timely discussion to be part on of all the jurisdictions to come together and provide opinions of this data strategy and how we can augment it towards directions that will be helpful and will provide benefit. We talk about privacy risks, which can limit free flow data. In the remaining time, I would like to focus also on data concentration and competition risks. With the development of the digital platforms models, we have experienced some great efficiencies and benefits. We are talking today through a platform because due to the pandemic, it was not possible to be in the same room all together. And I think that the issue is from the European perspective that there are some particular platforms that they have grown so much. They bring in touch different users of the ecosystem, business users, consumers, app developers, content providers. but they do that through the intermediation services. And in order to make their intermediation services valuable, they withhold information from the data they collect from the different sites. And I mean, one key aspect is how to enforce some form of digital sovereignty. And how do I define digital sovereignty? Is how we can redistribute the benefits through the operation of the platforms in a way that the other actors of the ecosystems, the business users, the consumers, they get a better share of this benefit. On the business user side, if they get more information about the ecosystem, they can design better services, better products, and they can reach consumers through alternative channels, not only through the particular platform which can facilitate this interaction. On the consumer side, they can be more information about the available options, both inside but also outside the platform. This risk of disintermediation can also introduce a competitive pressure in the ecosystem with further benefits that can be realized. So I believe we need to move forward to some rules towards a more symmetric information flow across the different actors of the ecosystem, starting from the very big platforms and enable the other actors of the ecosystem to get access to this information. With this respect and with regulation, yesterday, Europe published the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. Let me, in 2 sentences, because my time is already consumed, say that the scope of this regulation is, first of all, to provide more transparency on the online ecosystem, the users to be better informed how their data is used, why they see a particular ad when they click, when they search for a particular keyword. So to have a more transparency over the business model and how it works of the very big platforms. This applies to the very big platforms. But on the other side, the other measures focus on allowing business users to use multiple platforms and not being only attached in one platform. Consumers not to be locked in a particular relationship with the platforms, but also explore other options outside the platform by minimizing switching cost. That was published yesterday. Happy to elaborate further on that, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Georgios. I want to give an opportunity to Anand to comment, to respond to comment. In particular, I would be interested if you could inform us a little bit about the second issue that Georgios addressed. He first addressed, like you, the data protection issue, and where there may be trade-offs also with sort of economic issues about sort of data flows and sort of the economic value of the data. Then there's the second issue that he addressed is platforms. No, those platforms, they also happen typically not to be European platform. I suppose not so much Indian platforms. They tend to be more US based platforms and more also Chinese ones. So if you could also, I mean, in addition to commenting on Georgios, if you could, give us a feel for what is the approach in India about the regulation of platforms, that would be very useful. Thank you.
Sure. So I will really take that head on, because I think that's one of the most important questions today when we are talking about especially digital technologies and regulation. And data protection is, of course, one aspect of it. But I think the bigger set of questions around platform responsibility are really to do with what are they responsible for and what not, right? And this has a significant economic impact, because finally this goes to the very nature of the business model. So to go back to the history of all of this, I mean, and that explains in a sense why many of these platforms are American. You have the Communications Decency Act and Section 230, which really gave that freedom to platforms, to be absolutely immune to pretty much everything that was going on these platforms. And back then, the idea was that the internet is this great marketplace of ideas, and there was a whole libertarian, understanding of what the internet is meant to do, freedom and anonymity over the internet, causing, a lot of positive benefits in terms of expression and so on. And businesses, as we know, were built, and huge platforms were built on this whole model of free, freedom from liability, right? Intermediate, I mean, what you call the intermediary immunities. Now, coming to India, matters were not actually that simple at the beginning. There was, in fact, a very famous litigation against one of the senior executives at eBay for this MMS, clip, short video clip, which was shot clandestinely by the paramour of this girl, school going kid, and then unfortunately that was sort of sold online, and it really became, I mean, on eBay, and it became a huge controversy. And of course, then there was this whole tension, right, between how do we kind of regulate platforms and stop all of this from happening, while at the same time understanding that there is a huge economic impact. And that's how the Section 79, 81, mechanism really sort of came about, along with, of course, the rules under the Information Technology Act. I don't want to get into the details, but the short point is that in some sense, we agree on the point that if you do not have control over, if you do not select the content, or if you do not modify the content, then as an intermediary, you are not liable, but you have to still maintain what is called due diligence, right? So for a long time, we have been operating under this due diligence model. So to comply with the due diligence standard, you have to do certain things, most important of which is that there is a takedown procedure. And the Indian Supreme Court has clarified in a 2015 verdict that not anyone can write to a platform and ask them to take down content. It has to be on the basis of a judicial or an executive order. So this is where matters currently stand when it comes to content that we find unacceptable. But what is happening now is that post Cambridge Analytica and post, even a lot of state elections in India, there's a lot of fake content that is, especially in the context of electoral integrity, which is disseminated fast and loose. There's also other kinds of, fake content, conspiracy theories, all of that. And overall, it has become a difficult, question to address in terms of how do you regulate them. And now the answers are veering towards saying, look, you are the guys with the resources, right? You are huge platforms. You are not what the platforms of 2005 were, right? You are a very different beast altogether. And since you are the big tech guys, why don't you kind of, one, introduce technology to address some of these, I mean, automate these processes, and we can talk about the merits or demerits of that whole, measure. And two, that, why don't you kind of bring upon yourself more liability as well, right? So if you are unable to do all of this, then you should have a grievance officer in India. If you are above a certain size, there are certain things that need to be complied with, and so on, right? So basically where the country is going now, and we have not gone there fully yet, because this is a proposal in a draft stage right now. This is the proposal to amend the intermediary guidelines rules that I was speaking about. But the general perception is that due diligence is almost on its last legs, and we are going to move to a very different regime of, even if not strict liability, of very strong, vigilance expected from digital platforms. I don't know, Andre, whether that really clarifies certain things, but this is where we are at this point on content on the platforms. Of course, competition among platforms and so on, that's a completely separate issue, and I'm happy to take up that, whenever there's a question coming there.
No, thank you, Anand. I think that does, at least to my ears, it does clarify very well the situation. Georgios, do you want to add anything to this conversation?
Yes. First of all, I think that the liability issues that Anand mentioned are very important. And in order to define liability, the first question that Anand asked is very important. What the platforms are responsible for. So the Digital Services Act focuses on very large platforms which are defined based on the number of users they visit them over a specific period of time. They make the following, let's say, intervention to these markets by imposing particular rules that there should be better transparency, more clarity. They define specific liability rules, and they also define the rules for content moderation, which is another important issue, especially when you are talking about illegal content. Now, I think a major innovation that comes through the legislative proposal by Europe, and probably it will be good if India takes a deeper look at that, is the ability of the enforcers, of the authorities, to access the information in the platform, either by having direct access to datasets or by asking to get access and use the algorithms in the platforms. So I think that is it is the first time that I see a regulatory proposal in a jurisdiction that goes so deep to these arguments. And again, the objective there is for the authorities to reduce the information asymmetries with the platforms. Is not only the information asymmetries in the ecosystem, it's also that the authorities that need to evaluate how platforms behave need to have access to more information on the platform. And I think that could be an interesting avenue that will generate a lot of discussions, and probably it will provide an example that with the necessary modifications can be implemented in other jurisdictions.
Thank you. So let me convey to you a set of questions that have come from Eke Weiss. Essentially, all the questions deal with the same issue, is about skepticism about the current regulatory framework. And I suppose he has in mind the current regulatory framework in Europe, in India, but I think even more broadly so. And I think essentially is conveying a skepticism that those regulatory frameworks, including GDPR, are really having the intended effect of providing sufficient protection. So, I mean, the sense that that firms can very easily go around that. And if I may add to that question, another dimension, one does hear sometimes, at least in Europe, that GDPR fails on two counts, not just on one count. So, number one, it does not protect. It does not really protect beyond the letter. The reality is not changing really behaviors. But secondly, as you alluded to, Georgios, is that it's hurting competitiveness of small and medium-sized firms. In a sense, sure, GDPR does have an impact on actors, but the main impact that it has is sort of a bureaucratic nature in that critique. It's adding costs, and the costs are relevant for the small and medium-sized firms. For the very large firms, it's basically irrelevant costs. So in a sense, it provides a further barrier to entry against the small and medium-sized firms. So in that critique, it would neither protect the consumer ultimately would neither provide privacy protection, nor would it sort of generate greater competition in the market, maybe the opposite. So I'd like to hear first from you, Georgios, about this, but I would like to hear also from Anand, from, you know, what is the discussion in India on the very same issue. Do we get, with the current legislation, sufficient protection? And to the extent that there is some effect, is that not effect detrimental in terms of opening the market to competition? Georgios, first.
Yeah, I think your assessment is fair. And I mean, I have to say that because I see a reference to specific scandals like Cambridge Analytica, that clearly that generates concerns to how effective is GDPR. But I mean, my approach will be a little bit different. It's not whether GDPR is effective. As a standalone regulation has some open issues, and I mean, you pointed them out. The important question is how we can build on this regulation for solving these problems. And I believe the key word that we should look for is transparency. And the transparency should refer to the platform actions, to the platform's obligations, to the ability of external users to get access, and which access to what particular data set they can get access through the platform. And I mean, I believe with this respect, the yesterday's Digital Services Act can be helpful. Of course, it focuses only to the very big platforms because it would have been too much excessive to impose some of the obligations, transparency obligations to other platforms. So it's a partial solution to this problem. But I believe that it is something that matches well with GDPR, builds on GDPR, and can bring more transparency, which can hopefully minimize some of the problems you refer to. That refers mostly on the protection side. On competitiveness side, you are also right. I mean, GDPR imposes further constraints, cost for handling data for small players. The open question for me is in the longer run, because in the short run, indeed, we see many studies that point out to the negative effects. In the longer run, my question is whether those costs will be compensated by having the consumers more convinced to participate through the digital channel because they feel that it is more transparent and they face less risks towards there. And I hope that will be the case. So again, it is a transparency question.
Very, very clear. Anand, what is the sentiment from the?
Yes, so I think transparency is, I think, a very important theme, and especially when we are now talking about the Data Protection Authority, there is a lot of concern that what we get essentially is a body that is not an independent regulator, but really controlled in many ways by the executive, by the political executive, and therefore there's a lot of call towards transparency. And in the Indian context, that transparency is very, very critical because, as I mentioned earlier, the Data Protection Authority has wide powers. So unless it is a fully independent body, there are huge concerns on its ability to protect the rights of citizens. The second sentiment is that the bill goes hard on industry and goes very soft on the state. And particularly because of one provision in this bill, which is clause 35, which talks about exceptions in the interest of law enforcement and national security. It is quite wide without any safeguards really spelled out in that provision. And one must contrast this with an earlier version of the bill, the 2018 version, which was the result of the Sri Krishna Committee deliberations, where too a lot of civil society actors were not happy with it, but at least it spoke about the triple test. It spoke about necessity and proportionality of state action and all of that, which are to anybody from the European Union very familiar themes, right? Because a lot of that jurisprudence comes from the European Court of Human Rights. So while all of that was there in the earlier version, the current one conveniently omits all that. Now, one could say that you can always judicially still read into any state action these parameters of review, but civil society is certainly not very happy with that provision and with the overall design of rights that is provided in the bill. Uh, on the point of competitiveness, I would take it in two different parts. So one is, of course, the exceptions that are carved out for small and medium businesses are not really exceptions. They are not, or not meaningful exceptions, I would say. So I think we need to really go back to the drawing board to think, and maybe the EU experience can help there. It would be probably useful to look at how small and medium businesses have been protected or accepted under the GDPR, and how those exceptions have worked in the GDPR experience, and maybe rectify something if it's not something very desirable in its operationalization in the EU context. The second part is what impact it has on innovation, right? Because when you say small and medium players, there are two kinds, right? The ones who are processing data and need to do whatever they have to do with data, and then the ones who are sort of really taking it to the next level, or are just technology companies. They may also be small, and the big question then is, what is going to happen if you have a super regulatory architecture, in the sense that your big guys, big tech guys can all comply, but your smaller guys will be hit in particular by provisions like the data protection impact assessment. I mean, that's an interesting provision because you have a similar mechanism in the GDPR, but it does not expect you to go to the authority for every kind of use of data analytics and so on, right? Or any new technological application. Only when the risk is above a certain limit that you need to go to the authority. But that's not the case with the Indian bill. Any case of usage of data with new technology by a significant data fiduciary needs to get the approval of the data protection authority. So it's almost like a licensing regime, right? So these things will have significant impact on innovation, because a bigger player might be able to wait it out, might be able to sort of say that, look, I mean, we go to market after 6 months rather than now, and the financial implication may not be much. But for a smaller player who's processing data, let's say a small drones company, for that, like to give an example, right, which is getting a lot of contracts but is not revenue positive at this point, or cash positive at this point, which will need to wait for 6 months or 8 months for the data protection authority, and in a context where it's a greenfield authority, right, not a brownfield situation here. So we haven't had any regulatory experience. So these are some of the concerns. I mean, and I don't know whether, I mean, industry is certainly not happy with the bill, and I'm not sure whether there is a clear window to address these concerns. We'll have to see how the bill gets operationalized to arrive at a final view on it. But currently, things don't look very optimistic.
Very good. Let me turn the microphone to Sandeep Bhardwaj, who wanted to raise a question. Sandeep?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Anant and Georgios, for an excellent, very informative talk. I was just hoping if I could get you to introduce another element into the conversation, which is balkanization of internet. Because 2020 we have seen in some way a qualitative shift in something that we have been worrying about for a few years now. TikTok has been banned in India. There have been other moves like this in or conversations like that in other parts of the world. And so broadly, if you could address the direction of balkanization and this whole thing that is happening. And I was hoping to add a supplementary question to that on a more specific level. There is certainly a nationalist impulse to create balkanization. There have been conversations in the past about having servers at a national level instead of having them internationally, things like that. But other than the nationalist impulse, I was also thinking, when we are talking about data regulation or things like that on a regional or a national level, can this also contribute to balkanization? Can we inadvertently, with our very good intentions, end up creating balkanization even though we didn't want to? If you could just reflect on those things. Thanks.
So should I respond? Yeah. Okay, so I think balkanization is a
Please,
very
Anand, please.
okay. I think it's a very interesting issue, and some of it, you know, we saw it. I mean, I think there are multiple reasons why we are moving in that direction. And not all of it is balkanization necessarily of the internet. Some of it is, just other ways of protectionism. So I would take that part first and then kind of address that. So I think there a lot of it is driven by investor interest, because there's a lot of fear that we spoke about platforms, right, Andrew, that these platforms are all American and or Chinese, and then we now need to build the Indian platform. Now, how do you do that? It's easy to say, but look, I mean, the user interface is great, and there's lots of interesting things that they are able to do. So one way to kind of do it is to set up regulatory barriers and say that we do not trust you enough. And then one way to do that is to then insist on measures like data localization. Now, again, localization is a very loaded term because there are too many variations to it and different. It's almost like a spectrum rather than a binary here or this or that. So, in that spectrum, we have seen multiple kinds of interventions, like the RBI came out with this localization directive, which was really about storing a you working copy in India, and then things like that. So that there has been talk about mirroring, there has been talk about hard localization, and the point that comes in here is that while investor interest is probably driving some of it is also driven by law enforcement imperatives. And like in the Indian context, again, this is a classic example of what you were alluding to, Sandeep, about the whole well-intentioned measures which may not necessarily lead to the best outcomes. So, I mean, in the context of law enforcement, the MLAT process, the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty process, has honestly not worked very well. And there is a huge amount of time lost in transit before we get data that is stored in the servers of a foreign technology, in most cases US technology company. So this has also led to a desire to store the data in India, and hope that by doing that we solve the problem, right? I mean, instead of doing all of this, approaching a magistrate there and that whole MLAT process, why don't we just simplify everything and place the server in India, right? And then of course the third element is, can this lead to more jobs in India and so on. So the overall balkanization that we are seeing is not the Chinese type balkanization, which is to firewall internet and say this is our internet and this is yours. It's much more to say, well, I mean, the internet continues the way it is, but you have to kind of store data in India, and therefore you rise up the regulatory, I mean, you kind of hike up the regulatory costs, and on account of that there may be entities that are not catering to Indian customers anymore, right? So though I think that's the fear of balkanization that we are confronted with. And yes, of course, I don't think that is the right measure. I certainly think reform of the MLAT process is in order. I certainly also think that India should take steps to avail of measures like the Cloud Act now in the US, and see if we can give that kind of confidence that data is protected in India without it being surveillance, without being surveilled by the state or something like that. So I think that really is what we should aim for, rather than impose localization, which in turn leads to a form of balkanization, if I may say so.
Georgios?
Yeah, so if I may add to what Anand said from a more economic perspective, clearly this balkanization has some cost. And the justification we see out there incorporates geopolitical elements. So to me, the key is to be able to increase the interoperability between the different regulations around the world related to data, which will make these measures of localization more difficult to be justified. And I think that is quite challenging to do that given the current geopolitical landscape. And I mean, we are talking about data that it is a relatively new asset, but we have problems related to geopolitics, tariffs in trade, that it is much more established across countries. So it is a very challenging problem. And I think if we promote the economic value of increasing the flow of data across our global ecosystem, it's probably one way to move forward in order to convince people to have less reservations towards the free flow of data, and sit in the same table and discuss how we can establish data regulations that they facilitate such flows.
Thank you. I believe Suman Berry wanted to come in now. Suman?
Actually, the last interchange addressed many of the points, but let me still, turn it into more of a policy issue, and this would really be for Anand. So, India's IT-enabled services industry is very dependent on the flow of data, um, and the question I have for you is. Uh, how is it that they, as it were, are trying to protect themselves in the face of the nationalism of the government in these matters? What is, particularly with respect to the U.S., what is the threat of retaliation that that industry is concerned about?
So I think, Suman, part of the reason why, uh, to an extent, I mean, so there is a clear pushback against localization from various kinds of actors, but there is also some growing support for it from industry. And I think the best way to understand this is to look back at the trajectory that Indian IT industry has taken, right? From a software services to a software products space. It's the moment when you transition to products that I think we are seeing a lot more support in many ways for localization, right? Because till that point, everyone wants free data, and yeah. So even some of the champions of software products today were in fact beneficiaries of free flow of data earlier, right? But suddenly they, and that's why I said investor interest is in many ways driving this support for localization. Now on the side of opposition, I think both the big tech guys and clearly the American companies, and many of your IT enabled services are against the idea of localization, and they have been pushing back, and that pushback did achieve some results too. To give you an example, if you look at the version on localization in the 2018 bill versus what you now see in the 2019 bill, I think the 2019 bill is a lot more uh, I wouldn't say liberal, but I think it's a lot better for sure. I mean, the 2018 bill literally said for all personal data, you have a mirroring requirement in India. And then, all sensitive personal data, it can only be stored in India and no data transfer. So now you're changing that stance a little bit, and saying that, well, critical personal data, yes, no question of it traveling outside. Of course, there is a lot of quibble over what that term means, and we'll have to see finally how it gets interpreted. But something like sensitive personal data, generally, there is no such imposition. And on sensitive personal data, again, while there is a requirement to maintain it in servers in India, there is a mechanism for data transfers outside the country. So I think there is some uh, backing down in some sense. Whether it is fully to everyone's satisfaction is a different question.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Um, I wanted to, if I may, I wanted to raise one issue that I think both of you have addressed, but perhaps not with that word, um, which is disinformation. So I'm an economist, and when I look at the digital platforms, I'm a user like all of us, and I see the huge economic benefits, both from a macroeconomic viewpoint, but also from at the micro level, from a user viewpoint. So I think, as long as I look at all of this from with my economic lenses, as an economic actor, I feel not only very satisfied. I feel that it has been great. It is great. And now, when I look with my eyes of a citizen and of a participant in our democracies, then I get a little bit more uncomfortable, especially because I see that on the occasions of elections, often, and in Europe, and I'm not looking from the European side, and you will comment from the Indian perspective, but from a European perspective, well, we are 27 countries, so there are elections, national elections, every year there is one election. And recently we had election in Romania, and there was a big jump of a far right party. And when you look at the involvement of that party, or friends of that party, murky friends of that party, you see that they were very active on some of the platforms, and them, or friends of them in some sense, and with a lot of disinformation. And equally in some countries, again, I don't know sufficiently the situation in India, throughout the COVID problems this year in 2020, there was a lot of disinformation, and that can have not only implications for democracy, even for lives of people. So there I'm concerned. So I'm less concerned of the use of my personal data or other people's personal data for purely commercial. Okay, I go on search engines, and in what order I get certain things, and do I get some ads that are tailor-made to me, to my previous searches? It's could be annoying, but just like it's annoying when I watch television, and and there are too many commercials. This is this kind of annoyance. The other one, the disinformation, which has a more political connotation, that can swing certain elections, that can increase populism, that can increase, that promotes sort of right-wing parties, of hatreds, all of those kind of issues, that concerns me much more deeply as a citizen, about or system, or democracy, the founding elements of our political system. So wanted to hear a bit from both of you, a bit from an Indian perspective and from a European perspective, which are very different in terms of their governance. What is the what is your personal reaction to that? And obviously there's a relationship between the two, no, from the economic and the political, because what we see is that disinformation sells, right? Not only disinformation affects the way people vote or behave in a political sense, but it also sells economically, right? People are attracted to some platforms because there is disinformation, and disinformation is something that that has a very quick dissemination, right? And because it has a quick dissemination and it has widespread dissemination, it attracts also advertising to the platforms. So the disinformation, so let's say the political dimension and the economic dimension are very closely intertwined. And so what I'm wondering is, can you approach this without taking that into account? India and Europe being democracies, how do we protect our democracies? Maybe Anand first?
Sure. I mean, it's a very complicated question.
Sure.
And,
just give us some elements.
Yeah, I know. And I think it's a theme, right? More than a question. I think you raised a very important theme. So, I mean, right now, a lot of responses are very self-regulatory in nature. And then Giorgio spoke about the the content moderation policies, and if you take in particular Facebook, because they are probably Facebook, WhatsApp are two big sources of information, or you could say disinformation, depending on how you look at what is going on. I think the community standards are actually quite dynamic in terms of responding to things. I don't think it's an easy exercise. So a lot of times the answer is, why don't you use more technology, right? I mean, that's not an easy answer, because technology has both over-inclusive and under-inclusive effects, right? I mean, often, something is a parody. It may be said in humor, right? And you don't want, in an ideal world, for someone to take that down. But at the same time, there is often just plain lies, and you don't want that to remain. And then what happens is, by trying to strike this balance, technology companies are struggling with this whole thing, right? I mean, it's not easy for them either. I mean, you can have human augmented measures, mechanisms, have more content moderators. Whatever you do, it's never going to be a perfect solution. But having said that, I think there are a few things that definitely stand out. The principle of platform neutrality, I think that is an absolutely critical one, and one can't, in any situation, do away with that principle, right? I mean, whether it's the left or the right, the kinds of views that are put out there, there has to be some very clear guidelines on how we are going to enforce takedown, right? Because otherwise, you are again in this whole terrain of, is Twitter pro-left? And you know the kind of impact that can then have on general public discourse, right? And that's something that I think must be avoided at any cost. So if something is hurtful, if something is offensive, if something amounts to hate speech, then it doesn't matter whether what the political leanings of the speaker are, and you take it down. But if something is basically a criticism of something else, right? Or again, when it comes to fake news, it's a very complicated issue, because falsity in itself is not a ground of regulation, right? What makes it a matter of concern is exactly what you spoke about, the virality. I mean, and that virality is what lends economic value often to the platform, because people like to kind of go to places where there is a lot of buzz, right? And virality and buzz are very
exactly
connected, right? So So I think there we have to really apply principles of platform neutrality, and that's where platforms will have to take a call that we have to forsake some of
Okay.
the economic revenue or gains from this, right? Because the moment it becomes a viral, piece of content, the radar should go up, and systems need to be built within organizations, big tech companies. That that's what we are really trying to address. And I think some of them have publicly gone on record to say that we are not going after every piece of content out there because it makes no sense. What we are going after is uh, things that have just come out, things that have the potential to attain virality. So we'll try and make our algorithms and our processes respond to that. And I think more work needs to be done in that direction, because I don't think we are ever going to have a clean internet without any kind of
Right.
negativity, any kind of that world is over. So we should then focus on how do
Okay.
we tackle the biggest set of problems. That's my.
Thank you. Thank you. So Georgios, in 30
Yeah.
seconds, if you could add something, I think we should come to the end of this
Yeah.
discussion.
Let me be very quick. I mean, some of these problems are generated by the business model of these platforms, as you mentioned before. I want people to be active as much time as possible in my platform. If they are attracted by disinformation, then I have a benefit to show such kind of content to them. So this should stop in the following way. Number one, fact-checking services, either in-house in the platform or by bringing third-party fact-checkers in the platform to evaluate the content. Second, transparency. We should ask the platforms to report why they show that particular news feed to that particular person and why. Both and the right for that should belong both to the authorities, but also to the individuals that news feed. Number three, digital literacy. We need to invest to inform people about the risk of online ecosystem and to make them to be more suspicious when they see this content.
Thank you to you both. It was a very, very interesting discussion. Let me now hand this to Sham with apologies for not being maybe sufficiently strict with my own timekeeping. So Sham, what do you make out of this with your wisdom and looking from a more geopolitical height?
Yeah, well, this discussion has actually left me somewhat apprehensive for the future, because what is very apparent from the discussion is that technology is running much faster than our ability to try and manage it. Either we end up by too narrow a sort of frame that we try to put on it, which then has consequences in terms of perhaps discouraging innovation. But if we are not sufficiently alert, then there can be very negative consequences, precisely for the reason that was mentioned, that the ability to amplify anything is what really is causing the concern, that once it gets amplified, then you are running behind trying to control it. It's the genie is already out of the bottle in a sense. So this is, I think, going to be a very critical issue, and here is something that I believe perhaps we have talked a lot about, say, multilateral processes and multilateral approaches to, say, trade, multilateral approaches as far as climate change is concerned. But this is perhaps a much bigger global challenge than all of that in a sense put together. So why is it that we are not looking at, is there some way, not perfect maybe, but we have today, really the way to describe the digital world is that it is anarchic. That is the only way I can describe it. That there is almost complete anarchy as far as the digital space is concerned. And if that is the case, then is it not time for us to really look at what are the ways in which, as an international community, we can try and deal with it? Because we are trying to sort of control small bits and pieces of this very large space, and that will simply not work. I mean, that's the sense I have, that whether you try to do balkanization, or whether you try to, target the big high-tech companies, this is not really going to lead you to a kind of a sensible management of the digital space. So I think one of the things that may be worthwhile doing, I mean, that's my sense, that is there some way that India and Europe, given the fact that we do believe that multilateral processes can yield somewhat more efficient, outcomes, is there some kind of an agenda that we can start working on together? I don't think we can take on the big sort of picture altogether right from the start, but are there some sort of openings which we can try to at least begin the process? The big tech companies and the state behind it, that is the United States, will not be interested in a global management. If you look at China, perhaps even China may not be interested, because they think that this is something which is giving them geopolitical space and geopolitical leverage. I think we are perhaps not quite in that space. And maybe we don't want to be in that space. So is there some way in which, given that somewhat convergent, I hope, situation, is there some way that we can start some conversation on this? Because there is a certain capability which is maybe diffused capability in India, but you have tremendous capability in Europe as far as this technology side is concerned. And is there some way that we can really talk about it? I mean, for example, if we take just the artificial intelligence space, the way in which it is developing without any kind of control is very worrying. So should there not be some norms, that if you take an example of, say, the genetic space, we did manage to have some kind of norms. Here we have no norms at all. So this is what I would like to conclude with. But I think our two panelists have really brought a lot of insights to this discussion, and I would really thank them for doing so. But as I said, I am left by their presentations much more worried than I was before. Thank you very much, Andre.
Thank you very much, Sham. I think that was a very useful way of rounding this session. So now I'm going to hand the floor to Suman Berry. Suman is a non-resident fellow at Bruegel. He has also an association as a senior fellow with the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. Suman has had many lives. A long life at the World Bank in Washington, and a long life in India, in various positions as member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council at different times, as the Director General of the National Council of Applied Economic Research, a major economic body in New Delhi, and more recently as the global chief economist at Shell in The Hague in the Netherlands. We are very grateful to you, Suman, to have contributed so much to this webinar, and for having accepted to draw the conclusions. You have been present throughout all the sessions, and so we are very keen to hear what is it that you draw as conclusions, both of what has been discussed and what it may mean for future work that together CPR and Bruegel may wish to undertake. Suman, the floor is yours.
I think he dropped out for a second. He should be joining back in. Let's just give him 10 seconds, 10, 15.
All right. I hope he can be back with us very soon.
Just till such time as someone comes back, this is Yamini. Sorry, something's happened to my internet, so I'm not putting on my video. But just on behalf of CPR to say a very, very warm thank you to both Ambassador Saran and Andre for your wonderful stewardship and chairpersonship of the sessions over the last 2 days, which really helped ground the discussions and frame our presentation. So thank you to both of you, and a special thanks to Sandeep too for everything he's done to make this happen. I see Suman is back, so over to you, Suman.
Okay, fine.
Is Suman back?
I can see his video.
I can see him too. First, he seems to be muted. He seems to be muted.
Yeah.
Suman, you seem to be muted.
No, I think
I don't know whether he can hear us.
I'm not.
I think there's something wrong with his line. His internet line is not okay.
Yeah, there seems to be some problems with the internet because mine never gives me trouble, but today it's choosing to do so. So maybe there's a very wide issue.
No. And we heard him 10 minutes ago, so I don't know. So perhaps
well, maybe give him a minute, and if not, then why don't you perhaps Yamini can conclude this session and summarize, and then we can go. Yamini, would you be ready to do that?
Yamini, would you be happy to come in now and give your conclusions?
Sure. All right. Well, as I said, just as we were signing off, waiting for someone to come back on. First of all, I just wanted to thank everybody for putting this very, very important session together. To be honest, my biggest takeaway from the discussions over the last 2 days is really, in some senses, a reaffirmation of where we began when we started these conversations yesterday, that there are in fact multiple areas where there are possible opportunities for us to deepen and leverage our engagements, both bilaterally, but also as participants, but also as a sort of communities in the global order, our collective commitment to a rule-based order, as well as the many very common challenges that we are confronting, which we've debated over the last 2 days. I think what's also very important about this conversation is that it has highlighted some of the very complex domestic challenges that and domestic locations from which both India and Europe are coming from, where sometimes there isn't quite clear meeting ground. But at the same time, there are commonalities, and there's a need, therefore, for better understanding. I think today's conversation about climate change really brought that out. In some senses, we are all committed to the same goal, there are common but differentiated pathways through which we need to arrive at them. The conversation we had about digital too, I think, has really framed a lot of this as well. There's a lot that we can learn from each other, even as we may be in different domestic contexts as we grapple with these issues. I think clearly, of course, the US and China are never going to move far away from our conversations. But I think Alicia yesterday provoked a very, very interesting way in which we could think about a possible new non-alignment that could at least be the foundation of a new way of building a dialogue between India and Europe. So I think this is our goal when we brought this conversation together, and Andre, you will recall as we started exploring the potential of coming together to set up these dialogues, was both to seek a better understanding of where India and Europe are on some of these global public goods and conversations both domestically as well as in how we want to position ourselves within the globe. And I think these conversations have been extremely interesting and useful in terms of being able to develop a better and mutual understanding of each other. And I think that there is a lot of potential for us to keep those conversations going. I think India and Europe in many ways need each other a little bit more today than we did in the past as we navigate our individual bilateral relationships with each other as well as with the United States and China. So there is, I think, a scope for deeper conversations on these issues. But there's also scope for deeper conversations on issues that we haven't touched upon through the course of these conversations. The issue of migration, very central in Europe in different ways, but critical to India too. The issue of terrorism, of pluralism. Gautam, in his opening remarks yesterday, as he was locating these dialogues in the geopolitical framework places, the issue of infrastructure. And so I hope, Andre, that this is the start of what will be a more long-term conversation between us as institutions, and also a space for us to learn about each other and dialogue for the future to deepen Indian and European relations. I think Suman is back, so let me hand over to him for his closing remarks.
Well, I'm not closing remarks, but just words of thanks, if I may. Three quick points, and then I think it's back to the co-chairs. One is to thank the two co-chairs because this is an enormous commitment of time by both of you. And you are both busy people. So for you to have taken this event this seriously is a source of is something I want to acknowledge. And both of you are in some ways foster parents to this. Sham by first suggesting that we embark on something like this, and on the way for, in a sense, saying to me that look. The medium is the message. This is about, let's not talk about deliverables. This is about two groups which need to know more about each other getting together. And I think given that goal, Andre, I would say that the proof of concept has worked. I would also refer, because I've been working on it, but also because it came up in the presentation by, at several points yesterday, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, but also Ignacio, that look, the G20 is very different from the G7. I mean, the G7 powers have a history of working together, and the thickness of their intellectual links has been honed over 60 years, 50 years. Now, the G20 is a recognition that the world has changed, but the machinery, things like the German Marshall Fund, this, that, that unites Japan, Europe, the United States. There's very little of that at the moment. And I think that I would submit that this initial 2 days and really the quality and interest of the audience suggests that there is a need for that as well. I should say that John Cunliffe, who used to be on the Bruegel board, once said at one of the Bruegel annual meetings that he despaired. He thought that the G20 could never work because of the difference in income levels and all of that. And so I think that that is the issue that's facing us now. What is the, as it were, intellectual glue that will make the G20, as it were, become fit for purpose for the world that we are entering? And so, in a very small and modest way, I think that we've, um, uh, dealt a blow in that direction. And so, Sham and Andre, godfathers of this, thank you both.
May I just add something, because I think we are missing out thanking a few people who are behind the scenes. So I would like to, on behalf of all of us who have taken part in this wonderful event, first of all, thank Sandeep Bhardwaj from CPR, who has really worked very hard to sort of put this together. The CPR communication team, which has enabled us to have this conversation with very few glitches, almost no glitches at all. And I need to thank them as well. On the Bruegel side, also, we have a few people who have contributed to this, but who have not been visible. There is Katya, who is of the communication team. She has worked very hard again from the other side to make sure that we are able to talk to each other. There is Yuyun Chan, if I'm getting that name right, and Henry Naylor, Scarlett Varga, and Matilda Sevon. These are the people who have really worked very, very hard behind the scenes to make sure that this event is of the highest quality. So thanks to the team on the Indian side, and thanks to the team on the Brussels side. Thank you. So Andre, back to you. Sorry, I intervened just to just to say thank you.
You intervene beautifully as always. So just 3 people I will flag. You have already mentioned, I think, all the people behind the scene were very, very important and extremely. So I want to thank Yamini. Yamini for having been present and having given a weight and stewardship to this whole event. I would like to thank equally Guntram Wolf, the director at Bruegel, for his support. I would like to thank Suman. Suman, we have had long discussions on this, and at some stage I got a bit worried whether this would take place. It was not always easy, and certainly the COVID crisis was a severe blow, but we all recovered from the blow, as I hope all of us will recover through 2021 from this very, very terrible year. And you, Sham, it has been really a delight to work with you and very much to benefit from your wisdom. I think you put this in the right framework, and I think this has been a very useful conversation. And I hope more, not only to the intellectual community, but that indeed this is useful from the intellectual to the policy community. So wish you all well, wish you all a very, very happy New Year, and looking forward to seeing you all and many more friends in 2021. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and all the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, audience.
Thank you.